Well, so today we are looking at chapter 24 of Genesis. We are continuing in the story that we started, I guess it's been 5 weeks now. And today we have a break. So we started the story looking at the story of creation, and then we moved pretty quickly into the Abrahamic saga or cycle. And so now we move into the Isaac cycle. There's a number of things I want to speak to about that. But we'll speak about that in a minute. What I want to speak to before we actually get into the reading today is there's a kind of break in the text before this, but it's also connected in a way, and that is the death of Sarah. Sarah dies in chapter 23, and so we enter into chapter 24 with Sarah's death, but also with, if you look at chapter 24, verse 1, it says, "Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things." And so we enter into this story with the kind of ending of one generation. And so that kind of presents the problem of this chapter. And the problem of this chapter is finding a spouse for Isaac so that the covenantal promise can be fulfilled, so that the heritage or the lineage of Abraham can continue. And so I want you to pay attention to how this is kind of a new story, but how that's not disconnected from the story that comes before it. The other kind of secondary theme or focus of this story, I would say the primary is just finding a spouse for Isaac. But the second is the continued providence, the continued involvement of God in the story of Abraham and Abraham's descendants. And so that kind of covenantal promise is one that continues. And as we wrestled with last week, this isn't a one-way street. This isn't about Abraham being faithful. It's about Abraham's relationship with God and both of them being faithful to the covenantal promise. And so I think we often think through, like, how is the human character being faithful in this story? But it's just as important to think about how is God, and maybe not faithful is the word we would use towards God, but how is God continuing to carry out this promise? Is God continuing to carry out that promise? That's really important for this story, because the responsibility of covenant entails two parties, and both parties have to be responsible to the promise that's been made. And so that's what we enter into today. The lectionary just completely, I'm trying to think of the word. It just sucks the life out of this story. The lectionary just gives us like 3 little sections from here and sucks the life out, and the story's terrible. If you're hearing this in church and they're reading it, it's awful. And so today we're going to read the entire chapter, which will probably take up our entire hour together. This is the longest chapter in all of Genesis. But I think it's important that we read it, because there's a lot of humor in here that's very subtle, especially for modern readers, and a lot of drama. So I want us to read the entire chapter, all 67 verses. One thing I want to point towards is there's a ton of repetition in this chapter. There's almost this story repeated 3 times. But that's important. It's a technique that's kind of building anticipation. It's slowing down the story, and it's making us or earlier hearers of this story anticipate what's going to happen. And it's kind of like we're like, well, get through this. And I think that's especially true for us readers today that exist in a digital kind of stimulated world, right? We want to know what's happening like this. We want action all the time. And this story slows that down by repetition. So pay attention even in yourself, how you're hearing this story and how that repetition's affecting you. If you're getting like, why aren't we jumping to the action? That's what the text is intending to do. And I think it does it more so to us as modern hearers in a way. So this is, I'm going to break this up into 4 sections. Because I think the story follows 4 sections. So let me see. Kim Toole, can you read verses 1 through 9? Okay. And then Marcia Rydberg, if you would read verses 11 through 27.
You want altar or NIV?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yep. And then this next section is verses 28 through 61, but I'm going to break that up. And so I'll read verses 28 through 41. And then Aaron McKinney, if you'll read 42 through 61. And then Dennis Brott, if you'll read 62 through 67. And guys, if we get through this without a hitch, we've done our job. We can all go home.
We are home. Okay.
Well, that's true.
Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham said to his servant, you're not reading, I am. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but will go to my country and to my kindred and get a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter.
And the servant took 10 camels from his master's camels, and all the bounty of his master in his hand, and he rose and went to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. And he made the camels kneel outside the city by the well of water at eventide, the hour when the water drawing women come out. And he said, Lord God of my master Abraham, pray grant me good speed this day, and do kindness with my master Abraham. Here I am poised by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the town are coming out to draw water. Let it be that the young woman to whom I say, pray, tip down your jug that I may drink. If she says, drink, and your camels too I shall water. She it is whom you have marked for your servant, for Isaac. And by this I shall know that you have done kindness with my master. He had barely finished speaking when, look, Rebekah was coming out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, with her jug on her shoulder. And the young woman was very comely to look at, a virgin, no man had known her. And she came down to the spring and filled her jug and came back up. And the servant ran toward her and said, pray, let me sip a bit from your jug. And she said, drink, my lord. And she her jug onto her hand and let him drink. And she let him drink his fill and said, for your camels too I shall draw water until they drink their fill. And she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough, and she ran again to the well to draw water, and drew water for all his camels. And the man was staring at her, keeping silent, to know whether the Lord had granted success to his journey. And it happened when the camels had drunk their fill, that the man took a gold nose ring, a beka in weight, and 2 bracelets for her arms, 10 gold shekels in weight. And he said, whose daughter are you? Tell me, pray, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? And she said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. And she said to him, we have an abundance of grain and feed as well, and room to spend the night. And the man did obeisance and bowed to the Lord. And he said, Blessed be the Lord, God of my master Abraham, who has not left off his steadfast kindness toward my master. Me on this journey, the Lord led to the house of my master's kinsman.
Then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. And Laban ran out to the man to the spring, as soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arm, and when he had heard the words of his sister Rebekah. Thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and there he was, standing by the camels at the spring. He said, Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside, when I have prepared the house and a place for the camels? So the man came into the house, and Laban unloaded the camels, and gave him straw and fodder for the camels, and water to wash his feet, and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until I have told my errand. He said, Speak on. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become wealthy. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female slaves, camels and donkeys. When Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and he has given him all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house, to my kindred, and get a wife for my son. I said to my master, Perhaps a woman will not follow me. But he said to me, The Lord before whom I walk will send his angel with you and make your way successful. You shall get a wife for my son from my kindred, from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath. When you come to my kindred, even if they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath.
When I came to the spring today, I said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, if you will, please grant success to the journey on which I have come. See, I am standing beside this spring. If a maiden comes out to draw water, and I say to her, Please let me drink a little water from your jar, and if she says to me, Drink, and I'll draw water for your camels too, let her be the one the Lord has chosen for my master's son. Before I finished praying in my heart, Rebekah came out, and with her jar on her shoulder, she went down to the spring and drew water, and I said to her, Please give me a drink. She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, Drink, and I'll water your camels too. So I drank, and she watered the camels also. I asked her, Whose daughter are you? She said, The daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him. Then I put the ring in her nose and the bracelets on her arms, and I bowed down and worshipped the Lord. I praised the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me on the right road to get the granddaughter of my master's brother for his son. Now, if you will show kindness and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, so I may know which way to turn. Laban and Bethuel answered, This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. When Abraham's servant heard what they said, he bowed down to the ground before the Lord. Then the servant brought out gold and silver jewelry and articles of clothing and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave costly gifts to her brother and to her mother. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night there. When they got up the next morning, he said, Send me on my way to my master. But her brother and her mother replied, Let the girl remain with us 10 days or so. Then you may go. But he said to them, Do not detain me, now that the Lord has granted success to my journey. Send me on my way so I may go to my master. Then they said, Let's call the girl and ask her about it. So they called Rebekah and asked her, Will you go with this man? I will go, she said. So they sent their sister Rebekah on her way, along with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, Our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the gates of their enemies. Then Rebekah and her maids got ready and mounted their camels and went back with the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left.
Hey, Dennis, you're not unmuted.
Sorry, this is
It's
from
okay.
this is from the message. Isaac was living in Negev. He had just come back from a visit to Berlehay Roy in the evening, and he went into the field. While meditating, he looked up and saw camels coming. When Rebecca looked up and saw Isaac, she got down from a camel and asked the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming toward us?" "That is my master." She took her veil and covered herself. After the servant told Isaac the whole story of the trip, Isaac took Rebekah into the tent of his mother Sarah. He married Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac found comfort after his mother's death.
Word of the Lord.
Hey,
Thanks be to God. Well, thanks to our readers. That was impressive. And thank you for all of y'all listening along. That's a long story. If you haven't read this before, it bears a rereading. There's a lot of detail here that the first reading misses out on. And so I'll try to point some of that out. But this isn't as familiar a story as other parts of Genesis, right? Even within the patriarchs, this isn't a story we often remember or that we were told as children or anything of that sort. I want to point out something as we dig into this text. Isaac is who this story is about, and yet Isaac plays no role in this story, essentially. There's a brief mention of Isaac at the very end, and this continues throughout the kind of saga or cycle of Isaac. Think about the stories you know of Abraham. Think about the stories you know about Jacob. Think about the stories you know of Joseph. I guarantee you could repeat numerous stories about each one of them, right? We don't have to get into Abraham. We've already gone through that. And Jacob, there's Jacob and Esau. There's Jacob becoming Israel and wrestling with the angel. And Joseph, there's the whole story of him in Egypt, right? These are stories we are intimately familiar with. These are patriarchs in this cycle of Genesis, and we can all jump and kind of spit off. Tell me one story about Isaac. Right? There's just Isaac is just a secondary character almost. The Isaac does not play a central role in any story, even in the birth of his sons, and the kind of contention between them of Jacob and Esau. Rebecca is the one in that story. Rebecca is the one pushing the action. Isaac obviously is giving a blessing, but the action, it's always like Isaac is in the background. I don't have an answer as to why that is, but it's interesting to think about in the larger story of these patriarchs. Why is Isaac always a secondary figure, essentially? And in this story, he's exceptionally passive. Think about Jacob, which we'll read about later, but Jacob with Leah and Rachel, and the action of Jacob in that story. And then think about this story. It's a servant going out to get a wife and bringing it back to Isaac. So that's just an interesting thing to think about. The other thing to think about in this story is the role of Rebecca. The way women were treated and seen in this time is drastically different to how we see and treat women today. And yet there are points throughout this story where her identity and individuality takes precedence. It's also smushed down at points. I'm not trying to dismiss that, but I want to point out that there is a kind of, she becomes a character in this in her own way in parts. That is contentious, as we'll see at the end. So quickly walking through this text, as I pointed out, Abraham is old, Sarah has just died, and so we enter in this story about how will the lineage continue. And for some reason, it falls upon Abraham essentially to find the spouse and not Isaac. And so Abraham sends out his servant, the oldest servant, who would have been, I guess, the trustiest. And there's this weird kind of oath he makes. Put your hand under my thigh. That's essentially a euphemism for his private parts. And the best commentators can understand is that's kind of, it's either signifying kind of the abundance or the authority of the figure who you're placing your hand. It's such a weird thing to talk about on a Sunday morning. but it's essentially kind of pointing towards the authority of the person. And some commentators say, well, maybe it's this kind of oath you're making that if you don't fulfill the oath, you won't have children, that your ability to procreate will be taken from you. We don't really know. It's not mentioned anywhere except one other place in Scripture. And so it's not a common oath that we see around. But I just want to point out the kind of strangeness of that. So there's essentially this oath made. I need you to go to the to my kin and find a spouse for my son. And we're never given a reason why it can't be a Canaanite, right? It's always just, it needs to be someone of my kinship. The covenantal promise, that's never really discussed explicitly, and so that's part of this story. And I think that's what our job as readers today is to discern, is where is the kind of cultural baggage of the day, and where is the theological proclamation of who God is and what God wants. And I would argue that I don't think the covenantal promise ever explicitly says you have to keep marrying. At least now it does in Deuteronomy, but it doesn't say you need to marry within your tribe. Anyhow, that's an explicit part of this story. And so I want to point you to verse 7, because this is really important. Or let me start at verse 6 just to give it context. Abraham said to him, "See to it that you do not take my son back there." There's a repetition of this again in verse 8. I think this is pointing towards Abraham has been given this promise, and that covenantal promise is to leave the homeland, to start a new life, to have thousands upon thousands of children, and to basically take this land that is a foreign land to him. And so I see this, do not take Isaac back there, as this, let's not regress. Let's not go backward, but the Lord is calling us forward. And then verse 7 says, "The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there." God is not mentioned in this story as having activity, as speaking, as being involved, except through the mouth of Abraham. That's an interesting thing to think about, right? There's this understanding that God is involved, but the narrator, we as readers, do not ever hear that God is doing this, this, or this, right? It's always just a kind of understanding. And so verse 8 then says, "But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there." That's really important to point out. The willingness is not on behalf of the woman's family, who traditionally would have the decision, particularly the males in charge of the household, but rather Abraham says, if the woman is not willing. Remember that verse. So anyhow, the servant goes out and he's there, and the servant in verse 12 begins to pray, and the servant's praying basically whatever Abraham said, let it come true. And there's this comical part in verse 15, the servant's kind of praying, and it says in verse 15, before he had finished speaking, there was Rebecca. So it's like if I was praying, "Oh God, let me have a bunch of gold," and all of a sudden gold just fell out of the sky, right? That's what happens here essentially. It's a comical, humorous scene, but it's also a proof, a sign, a symbol of God's providential care for Abraham and the continuance of his lineage. So Rebecca shows up, and Rebecca is overly hospitable. And who else is overly hospitable? Abraham, right? Abraham rushed out to help these three strangers at the Oaks of Mamre. And so now we have Rebecca kind of as a second Abraham, running out to the servant, not only getting the servant water, but getting water for the camels. I read in one of my commentaries that a typical camel drinks between 20 and 30 gallons of water at a time. And so you have 10 camels. Let's just go with a low number of 20 gallons. 20 times 10 is 200. So for her to get 200 gallons of water, would be a lot of work, right? So, I mean, not only is she strong, but she's overly hospitable, because you can imagine what it would take. I mean, think about just the time to get 200 gallons out of your tap, and then think about pulling that up out of a well, right? So the humor here is hitting us over the head, and it's just, it's humorous, and I don't mean to make that dismissive. It's funny, but it's also pointing to something. It's kind of like when Jesus is hyperbolic in the Gospels. It's drawing attention to something. So yes, it's funny that he's praying and she shows up, but it's also speaking to providence. Yes, it's funny that she would get 200 gallons of water, but it's also speaking to her just being a genuine person and a hospitable person. So this happens, and then there's this scene in 22 where he basically gives her the kind of, it wouldn't be like her dowry, but it would be a kind of pre-dowry. He's kind of giving her some money or some part of it, but not all of it. And then in 24, we get that, okay, she's part of the family. And if you remember, I think Marcia pointed this out at the end of chapter 22, which we read last week. It briefly mentions Rebecca. And so she comes back into the story here as family. And she's Isaac's second cousin. Remember, Abraham and Sarah didn't have the child until later in life. So the second cousin is essentially similar in age. So that happens, and then the man bows in verse 26 and says, in 27, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin." This is a benediction. It's a kind of ritual statement that would have been common, right? Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness towards my master. Steadfast love, the Hebrew word is chesed, and steadfast love is a great translation. You'll hear throughout the Old Testament steadfast love and mercy, but it also is a kind of the commitment to the covenant, right? The chesed is God's continuous covenantal commitment. And then it says, "As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin." Providence, right? Providence, the Lord is leading, but it's the discernment of the servant that recognizes it, and not the narrative isn't overbearing and saying, God did this, God did that, God did this. It's more understood than it is explicitly stated. So I'm not going to get into too much detail on what happens next, but we kind of, it's kind of implied that Laban's greedy. In verse 30, as soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arm, and when he heard the words of his sister Rebecca, "Thus the man spoke to me," and then he's kind, right? Rebecca is just kind outright. And Laban, it's like, well, the text, this is again humor here, right? The text is saying once he saw all these jewels, then he was genuine. And we know how Laban is later with Jacob in 29 and 31 chapters. So the story, the humor is happening again and again here. So the servant repeats his entire story, basically what Abraham told him. But I want to point out one part of his repetition. And in verse 41, when he's saying, speaking about if the woman comes or not with you for my son Isaac, 41 says, "Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my kindred. Even if they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath." Now go back to verse 8. And verse 8 says, "But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine." Abraham directed the servant, if the woman is not willing. The servant repeats the story to Laban as if the family is not. There's numerous ways to interpret this. I think that the main one is that, well, he's speaking to Laban now, and so he's trying to kind of butter up to the family. He's saying, well, you're in charge here. But Abraham, we have to remember, said if the woman is willing. So all this is repeated. And then in verse 15, Laban and Bethuel, who just speaks once. Laban kind of is the main character here as far as the head of household. And they say in verse 50, the thing comes from the Lord. We cannot speak to you anything bad or good. So they're in agreement, and essentially everything's to go forth. And yet the mother and the brother say, well, let us have 10 more days. And so the servant has this kind of like, let's get going. And the family slows it down, right? And so we as readers know what that's like. And so in verse 55, her brother and her mother said, let the girl remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go. But he said to them, do not delay me. Since the Lord has made my journey successful, let me go that I may go to my master. They said, we will call the girl and ask her. Again, this is not normal for the time. This is strange, right? Verse 50, the head of household, Bethuel and his son, are the ones giving permission. And now something has changed, and Rebekah is giving permission. And verse 58, and they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? She said, I will. I think what's going on here is there's kind of a overturning in a way of norms, but there's also a connection back to what Abraham said in verse 8. Abraham is saying if the woman says yes. And so the story takes time, but it eventually comes to the woman saying yes after the family has already said yes. And so I think it's connecting it to that kind of providential promise and God's oversight of Abraham and Abraham's lineage. So there's this weird blessing. I don't know if this, any of y'all that had children or grandchildren go off to college, but maybe this is the blessing you give them when they go. In verse 60, may you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. What a weird thing to say to someone that's leaving, right? That's just strange. You know, I hope you have tons of kids and your enemies, you know, are at your foot. But take your Bible and go to 22:17, which we read last week. So verse 22:17 from the end of the binding of Isaac is, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. It's almost word for word. It leaves out some, but it's almost a word for word reproduction of the blessing that angel gives to Abraham. And so again, we see a connection between Rebekah and Abraham. I think that's another interesting thing about this story is there's a comparison drawn between the male patriarch Abraham and the female spouse-to-be Rebekah instead of the son who's, you know, going to be the patriarch Isaac, right? That's another interesting thing about this text. Rebekah is hospitable like Abraham, and Rebekah receives a blessing like Abraham. We don't get any of that with Isaac. So Rebekah goes with the servant, goes back to the land, and then there's this really funny part in verse 64, and the NRSV kind of hints at this, but I don't think any of the texts get at the Hebrew here, but it says, and Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel. The Hebrew says she fell off her camel. So there's this scene, you know, she's ridden, and then she sees Isaac and she falls. So again, there's humor throughout this story, and it's really hard to pick up sometimes as modern readers, especially reading translations. But again, Isaac is so passive in this scene. Verse 65, or excuse me, I'll start at 64. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, who is that man over there walking in the field to meet us? The servant said, it is my master. So she took her veil and covered herself. The veil covering is more to imply that she's betrothed than kind of like the culture of the day. 66, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. So again, Isaac is not the one taking initiative here. The servant is doing it, or Abraham's doing it on Isaac's behalf. 67, then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. That last verse has a ton in it. Let me end with this. Isaac brings her into mother Sarah's tent. Mother has died. And so again, after death, there is life, right? This is the kind of covenantal promise that in spite of death, life will come. In spite of burdenness, or barrenness, sorry, in spite of barrenness, there will be life. And here, in spite of the death of your mother, there will be new life. You will have a life again. I think this is really interesting too, because it says she became his wife and he loved her. Love was not a normal thing back then, right? And unfortunately, marriages were essentially property transactions. And so love wasn't always part of the picture here. And for the text to state that is really interesting. And I would say means it in a way, in a much stronger way than if we would say that in a story today. And then lastly, we get a sense of Isaac's grief. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. And so this kind of reconnects us to the preceding chapter. I want to say a couple quick things about this story, and that the character of Isaac is passive, and yet there's a sense of this is a person that suffered deep trauma, right? He's got old parents. He's nearly killed by his dad, and in this very ritualistic way, some of the early Jewish commentators in the Midrash said that Sarah dies because she hears about what happened in the chapter before. She hears that Abraham tried to kill their son, didn't, and then she passes away, because in the story, 22 is the binding of Isaac, 23 is the death of Sarah. And so there was this, in the early Jewish community, some said that. And so if that was that traumatic to Sarah, think about how it was for Isaac, who underwent it. And then Isaac plays this behind the scenes. So I'm reading into the text here. This isn't what the text says, but I think of Isaac as this very sensitive, traumatized person that has undergone a lot. And so he's not gung-ho like Abraham is, in this hospitable but trusting and adventurous person. And he's not the kind of conniving person that Jacob is, or the depth of wisdom and foresight that Joseph has. Rather, he's this kind of sensitive, behind-the-scenes character that we could assume is traumatized in a way. For him, the death of his mother was a huge event, right? The text states that. And right, we're getting a lot here in just a small amount of space. And so if something's included, it's important. The other thing I want to think through is, what is the role of Rebekah in this story? She's one of the primary characters, her and the servant, and she plays counter to a lot of roles of women in this day, and that's played both by her part, but also the part of the story. The role of God. God is not present in this story as the story is telling it. It's assumed on the part of the characters, right? Abraham says an angel will go before you. The servant prays to God. The servant says that benediction, God has blessed me and God has done this. So I want you to think about, what does that imply for faith? Because this isn't kind of like a puppet master, God pulling the strings, but rather what Walter Brueggemann calls a mature faith on the part of the people in the story. They are assuming, they are hoping, they are trusting, they are believing that God is present, that God is involved, and through their actions, they carry that out. And then there's this kind of hindsight where they see, or they discern, that God has been involved, that God has acted through the story. The last part is faith, and I think that ties into this covenant, is what is the faith of the servant in this story, to go out, to do these things, to pray to God, to believe that it will happen in spite of all the things that could go against it. And then lastly, this kind of, what I think is so central to Genesis, this promise of life in spite of or against death. And it takes many forms and fashions, but for Isaac, for our passive and who I'm calling a sensitive character, in the wake of his mother's death, a new life comes with his new spouse, Rebecca. And that's someone that he loves, and that's not a light thing in this day and age. So I've spoken a lot and we've read a lot, but let's open this up to discussion. What are your thoughts on this kind of lesser known story and this lesser known patriarch and matriarch? And what questions do you have?
Go ahead.
Sybil?
This is picking up on the humor in the story. Bill and I met at a private junior college back in the olden days in Orlando, Florida, and it was a private junior college with a Christian focus. And the president of the college required all the students to take 1 year of Bible, a semester of Old Testament, a semester of New Testament. And we used the KJV version. Well, when we got to this part, and we're reading that, as you said, Rebecca fell off the camel. In the KJV, it says she alighted from her camel. And at that point, the professor would always stop and he said, I want you to pay attention. It says she alighted from her camel. It does not say she lighted up a camel.
Which was a cigarette brand, in case you don't get the joke.
Yeah, I get it.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So, oh no, I'm really old.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I don't think they had Camel cigarettes back then, but I get the story and the humor on that. Thanks
It was his way of saying
don't smoke.
smoke.
Yeah.
And Will, if I might, just a quick comment, and I may not be quite following this exactly, but you talked about repetition, and a part of it is that what is told to the servant, he tells either just to Rebecca privately or to the family. I think first to Rebecca. And my take on that is that gives her the opportunity to have some understanding of how he got there. If you imagine his not saying that, then it seems to me it's almost beyond the reach of being reasonable. But to hear that story, and while God is not mentioned, at least my fantasy is she has the opportunity to decide there's something at play here that's greater than, in some ways, greater than just these exact details. And so, again, we may be reading something in, but I can identify with that. If you have a sense that there's something at play here that's more important than just myself and my journey, it offers an opportunity to step beyond yourself.
Yeah, verse 27 I see as the moment that she's brought into the covenantal promise. That's when he kind of tells her why he's there, what his purpose is. And it's not fully telling that, but it's giving a kind of hint towards that. And I think too, the tension in this story for us as modern readers is to read into, I think we have to do two things. One is there's just always cultural baggage. And that's just the way it is. I've spoken before about, I had a professor in seminary that always said, don't throw the fish out with the fish bones. And her point being is, you're never going to get a perfect text as you want it, especially as modern readers reading a 2,000-year-old, 3,000 or, however, 2,500-year-old text. And so we have to be discerning as to where is God in this and where is just the culture of the day. But I think one of the interesting things about this is, like you're saying, is that Abraham says, let the woman decide. The servant initially speaks to the woman. Now Laban and Bethuel come back into it, but ultimately, right at the end, right before she leaves, she's given the decision, and that stands counter. And so I think that is an interesting thing for us to think about, is how can we stand counter to the bad parts of our culture today? And where is our culture influencing our interpretation of God too? Thanks. Who else has thoughts or questions or reflections? Marcia? You want to unmute? Yep.
Yeah, a couple things. Your friend Alter suggests that the reference to Bethuel being at this meeting, Laban does all the talking, and he suggests Bethuel's probably dead, and it was a later addition, maybe to a scribal addition to add Dad's name. Makes sense to me on a lot of levels that he probably is gone. The gifts were just to, Mom and Laban, and there was nothing about a gift to Dad. And why is Laban speaking if the patriarch is still there? So she's getting kind of a new father in a way when you marry father-in-law, and they become very important in your life. And she may have been kind of Dad's call anyway. I think it would be very hard to just up and leave your family and go as far away as where Abraham is. I mean, that's not an overnight trip home to visit Mom. That's with a daughter who lives on the other side of the world most of the time. I know that's pretty tough, and yet she just stepped right up and said, I'm gone. And so I've started to see the patriarchs a little bit different. I'm seeing Abraham, Rebecca, Jacob, and Joseph. She handles, she's in charge of who comes next. She orchestrates that Jacob's going to be next. And so she pretty much has orchestrated this. I was going to mention how much it took for to water the camels, but one of my texts said that also, like 250 times to the well to get the camels watered. She was large and in charge, and somewhere. And what was the servant doing? Did he help at all? No, he's sitting there watching her. That one was another humor to me. Well, what's the old guy doing? He's watching the cute young girl. Somewhere, and I can't find the reference to it. The rabbis talked about I think 7 beautiful women of the Old Testament. And Sarah was one, Esther was one, but Rebecca was one also. And so she was both beautiful and she knew her own mind. She was in charge.
Thanks. Yeah, Rebecca stands in deep contrast to Isaac in this story, and I would argue throughout the kind of Isaac cycle, which is more, like you're pointing out, a Rebecca cycle than anything. Rebecca is the predominant player throughout that. So we can say the God of Abraham, Rebecca, and Isaac, or Jacob, instead of Isaac and Jacob. Thank you. Who else has a comment or a thought? Pam?
You're muted, Pam. And then Sherry had her hand up as well.
Okay. Pam, you need to unmute yourself.
Still muted. There you go.
Okay, mute. I'm on mute now.
Nope. No, you're good.
Okay, good. I was really influenced by the book, The Red Tent, of how important Rebecca was as a matriarch. And I think it is so interesting that the Jewish mothers today have so much power behind the scenes. And it's sort of the beginning of Abraham being the patriarch. And in the book, Rebecca really takes care of the women. We forget the women are like, there's 6 wives of one and they're having kids all the time, and they have to make sure that they segregate in the time of their period, and they all go into this red tent. And it was an amazing book if you want sort of a secular view of how these tribes were working, and the fact that this was such a strong woman that it created a whole lineage of women that looked up to Rebecca. And I loved Marcia's word of orchestrating. And the other thing I wanted to say about the servant in a lot of the Roman comedies is much smarter than the master and really leads people. And there's this role of the servant as being kind of the person that guides the action. So I don't know how much that influenced this or where the timetable would be.
Yeah, I couldn't speak to that I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, there are definitely biblical examples where the master is, or excuse me, the servant or slave is smarter. But I think more and so in this one, it's kind of portraying his faith or trust. There's a reiteration over and over again of the you know, the God of my master Abraham.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks. Sherry Leffers.
I may come and go because the reception is kind of bad. But what I was going to say is, I really like, as Marcia said, the strength of Rebecca here, and I think it's a lot of a reminder of Mary. You know, she almost says, "Here I am, Lord." She accepts that she's going to marry this person. She travels 500 miles to suddenly be the beginning of a new group of descendants, just as Mary travels all that time to Bethlehem to have Jesus. And I just see this wonderful thing. And part of that strength of her, one of the translators said that the veil could also have been her idea of, this is my space still. I'm a strong woman. I've made this trip and this is my space. You're not coming into my space until it is the right time.
That's interesting to think about. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that is pretty insightful to think about. She's putting that on right when she sees Isaac, and obviously what the veil would imply in a kind of cultic sense within the temple. Thanks for sharing that. Rebecca reminds me of Ruth. And I like your bringing in Mary too, because I think Mary is shown to be this this beautiful but yet decisive woman, right? Think about the Annunciation. It's boom. And so that's an interesting connection. Thanks for bringing that together. Also, I think a lot of Mary is shown as kind of an apex of these Old Testament women, right? These women that overcome struggles, whether it's Hannah or Sarah, and yet they persevere in spite of it, and they bring new life into the world in spite of it. Thanks. Who else has a thought or question?
Will?
Yes.
To your point that Isaac is...
No, we can hear you.
Yeah. Anyway, to your point that Isaac is in the background, it occurs to me as I'm hearing this story for the first time that he's somewhat a symbol of laughter. Perhaps it's fitting that this laughter is lurking in the background. In fact, he might even be regarded as a symbol of ironic laughter.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting to think about, the ironic laughter. I hadn't really picked up on how behind the scenes Isaac was until I was reading through this again, which is kind of shocking to me because it's pretty evident. So I guess that doesn't speak well of me. But yeah, it's interesting to think of an irony behind that. Thanks, Dave. Yes.
It's Deb. Just a question. What comes to mind here is the Old Testament at this point is very patriarchal, etc. But when was the transition where in Jewish society these eons ago, where the wife, the woman in a family became more important to concerning the lineage of the family? And what I'm trying to say wasn't the woman critical in this society, at least for bearing children, but also influencing the lineage as well?
So I think that happens, from what I understand, because in a day and age when you don't have paternity tests, the mother is, you can guarantee who the mother is, whereas right, you can't guarantee who the father is. And so I don't think it's placing an importance on the woman, unfortunately, as much as it's saying, well, we know for sure that this is the mom.
Well, today, and we have relatives that are partly Jewish, and apparently it is critical to know the mother's lineage as well as the father's. So that's why I don't know when that criticality was instituted. That's all.
Yeah, I don't know a specific date on that. I know the kind of the reasoning behind it, but I don't know a specific time in that. But yeah, that obviously it continues to this day. I don't think it's continuing to this day because issues of who really is the father, but more so that that's just a traditional thing.
Okay.
I'll see if I can find anything on that. Betsy?
Okay. It might be the romantic in me, but when you said she fell off the camel, I thought, oh, she was struck. That's a beautiful woman. And the servants must have been saying that came along with this wise servant, all his men, oh, we're now entering Abraham and Isaac's land. So I just can foresee that, oh, he kind of knows there's somebody coming, and she is overtaken by, oh, this is the man that I am going to. And so she falls off the camel, and she's beautiful. And here Isaac's had this traumatic life. What a wonderful thing God's doing. And if they're going to have 12 children, there sure better be a little heartbeat between the two of them. So that was my thought. And then the other thing was, Abraham was such a wise man. He probably chose a servant to go who he knew was a very God-fearing and maybe just a wonderful, had faith and trust in God. And so he picked a very wise servant and dependable to go on this trek. If you're going to choose somebody to go, pick the wife that's going to be the next in line for your kin, you're going to choose somebody that you really value and respect. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know that's one way to read it, right? She's struck by this strange man and falls off her camel. It could be she just falls off her camel, and it's kind of hilarious. She does ask afterwards in the next verse, who is that man over there walking in the field to meet us? So they are tied, at least in that way. So there is precedent to take what you're saying.
Yeah, well, the translation I have here is she jumped down from the camel and asked the servant, who is a man walking through the fields to meet us. So
yeah,
it's not an accident in this translation. She's definitely going for him.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing, that there's a number of kind of interpretations of that verb, but the Hebrews more so fall than intentional. But thanks for that. What translation is that? Is it the JPS?
That's the let's see, what's it called, Debbie?
Jerusalem Bible.
Jerusalem Bible.
Oh, okay. Thanks. So unless there's anyone else, I wanted to say one quick thing. Okay, so I want you to think about how you think about providence in God's life over the next week. How do you think about God's involvement in your life? And I would wager, because this is how it is for me, and this is largely how our society is set up, is that we think largely in that God's involvement in my life as an individual. God's doing this for me in this specific way. And I think one thing that the text challenges us with, and this is where we have to be kind of critical as a community of our own cultural baggage, is we often think that God's kind of pulling the strings for me as an individual and doing this for me. God help me with my job. God help me with this. God help me with that. And I think this text challenges us in a way to think more so in a communal way about God's involvement in the world. And not so much, now granted, this story is very much about finding a spouse for Isaac, but there's a servant involved, there's another family involved, there's distance traveled. It's this larger story, and it plays into this larger story of Abraham's family. And Abraham's family, right? It's a family as in like one family, but it's very much more symbolic of God's relationship with Israel, with a people. And so one thing I've been thinking through, one thing I've been challenged with this text is, what does it mean to think about being God involved in our lives instead of God involved in my life? And how does that play into my prayer and my faith? So I'll leave you with that. Let me pull up our benediction and we can close with it. I'm just making it bigger, so all right. Share screen. All right, let's close with the benediction. Let us go from this place remembering God's words to Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Let us go from this place proclaiming Jacob's words. Surely the Lord is in this place. Amen. We might have to change that to say the God of Abraham and the God of Rebekah. You know what? I'll make that change now. There we go. All right. Next week we'll say it a little differently. All righty. Thank y'all. I'll see y'all in a week. Thanks for joining me after your wild 4th of July. Bye.